This is the Friends of History Debating Society. I am Gaius. These are the Londinium Chronicles. Thankfully, Germanicus is home safe from his adventure to the edges of the empire, where he was welcomed by the centurions and kept safe, despite his effort to be risky on the roads. However, he's back in Londinium. We're far from Rome, happily, and we're reflecting on the events of the 21st century. We can set aside the events of our century, the first century AD, although there will be a moment for us to draw on our education. What does a Roman equus-class gentleman learn in school these days? Everything about the Gracchi brothers, the Sulla rising, the Catiline conspiracy, Caesar, the murder of Caesar, all the way up to the first princeps. That's what we're drilled with. That's why we live there. That's why we promote it, because it's what we were given as children to understand why the emperor is so successful, why the empire is so critical, why our empire and not another empire. However, we're going to apply that lesson later on. We begin with events in the 21st century. Germanicus, there's much in the field that suggests that the Americans, while generally uninformed that they're building on the foundation of Rome, are following, well, you know the phrase, history doesn't repeat, but sometimes it rhymes. The rhyme that I most enjoy is the ultimatums issued by the emperor, sometimes called the president, for the gangsters in Gaza and for the gangsters in Caracas. There's no other way to identify this than, well, Caracas, for example, it occurs to me that the emperor is taking advantage of the little set piece that Pompey prospered with when he suppressed the Silesian pirates with his navy. And the ultimatum against the Gazan gangsters reminds me again and again about how emperors don't negotiate. There's not a trade-off. When they issue an ultimatum, that's the deal. And what comes behind it is the hammer blow. I believe the 20th century has some sense of it, but I'm not sure. There's a lot of hesitation to recognize this is straightforward power. Now, I come to you also not just to comment on princeps, Trump, but also that Putin has the same power. And it's not generally understood that when he issues an ultimatum or when he puts in motion an aggression, it must be answered by weaker states. For example, the harassing of the Western Europeans, especially the frontier, the NATO frontier, with, this is an allegation, I'm not in a courtroom here, I'm more Ciceronian than I am, Perry Mason. But in any event, the allegation by a number of EU leaders that the Russians are using drones to harass us and to intimidate us. There was an emergency meeting in Copenhagen on Thursday last, chaired by the Prime Minister of Denmark, who heretofore has been quite dovish. It was attended by all the major powers, including the President of France. The Prime Minister of Britain came, and they were discussing what is to be done with something they've created called a drone wall in their minds. They want to put up a drone wall, similar for the Great Wall of China, similar for walling off a besieged city. I don't know where they're going with this, but most important to me, for you to comment on, to my reading, not only did the U.S. not chair the meeting, it was not a principal contributor to the results of the meeting, and there was no rush to the White House for a comment on a drone wall. Is that a success of our princeps, Mr. Trump, or is that Europe ignoring the power of the empire? Good evening to you, Germanicus.
Good evening, Gaius. I feel that we have different eras to call on for comparison to what is happening in the American empire of the 21st century. And in some ways, the approach that Mr. Trump is taking as princeps or basileus, if you prefer, is the approach that was taken by the Roman emperor in Constantinople after the fall of the Western Empire. And there was only one Roman Empire at that point and only one capital, and that was Constantinople. And much of what Mr. Trump is doing now is very reminiscent of how the emperor, the Roman emperor in Constantinople, dealt with the new barbarian kingdoms that were emerging in Italy or in what we now call France, which had been Gaul and became Francia when it was taken over by the Franks, the Visigothic kingdom in Spain, and the Burgundian kingdom, the Vandalic kingdom. Those that were enemies, Rome overthrew. But those that were allied, Rome used to the extent that they could, and sought to, again, as best they could, manipulate relations between the kingdoms, the new kingdoms, and the emperor, who still was the top man, the princeps. And this is an approach that feels similar, in which the American emperor in Washington treats with the Allies now not as though they were directly a part of the empire anymore, but are still considered as lesser rulers, lesser regia, kingdoms that are subservient to Washington, but not necessarily under our control. So this is a distancing that still preserves the fact that the U.S. is the leader, and the empire is still intact, but it's not necessarily directly administered anymore. And that is a very interesting shift that's occurring. And it's occurring in large part because the U.S. has two objectives that are in conflict. One is to remain the leader of not just the free world, but to the extent possible of the known world, and to maintain the sway of Romanitas. But at the same time, it doesn't want to be tied down or dragged down by the affairs of these lesser allied kingdoms. And so the goal is to maintain this titular supremacy, which is what Constantinople did in late antiquity, and at the same time not to get too sucked into the affairs of various Lombard dukes or Frankish kings unless absolutely necessary. And so I see this as a reordering, because the Roman Empire did reorder itself at the end of the 5th century, and this is the way it did it. So the idea was that it was still the empire, and these new kingdoms were still a part of the empire, kingdoms of the empire, as it were, but not directly ruled. And this is funny, because one of the ways that Constantinople did that is that the emperor would bestow titles, Roman titles, on these barbarian kings. So, for example, when Clovis was crowned in 511 as king of the Franks, there were Byzantine envoys there who appointed him as a Roman consul, a lesser office than emperor, obviously, and also patricius, as in patrician, and many other titles, all of which identified and solidified his legitimation by Constantinople, but also his subordination to the Roman emperor. And the Franks remained loyal allies of Constantinople for the next almost 2 centuries.
Yes, no one no one is entertaining the idea that this meeting in Copenhagen was a break with the princeps. No one.
Right.
And the princeps is busy in fortifying his redoubts. That would be Fortress America. But there were no sharp words, where's the U.S.? As we heard in the early days,
Right.
it was clear that the princeps is no longer interested in sustaining NATO, regarding it as an artifact of the 20th century, not useful in the 21st century.
Right. And it's a deep truth that hasn't been revealed to the American people is that Europe is not threatened by Russia. Europe is doing what it's doing because it wants to distract its increasingly restive electorates with a bigger threat. And they have to manufacture that threat, and yet they can't turn that threat into a war. So what they're doing instead is creating incredible paranoia in European populations. So, for example, in Denmark, after this alleged drone incursion from the sea, the Danes are buying emergency rations and bug out packs and tents and who knows what, and it's a way to distract European electorates from the crisis that is overtaking Europe.
Also, to move the money through the legislature.
Yes.
For the defense industry. Yes, they're going to build. Now, a detail about what's happened, and the centurions who are listening to us, we're going to get to you guys, okay? We're dealing with transfer of power that's underway. I want to speak to NATO just a moment, Germanicus, because I've been reading. It's always dangerous to read 20th century history. I've been reading about, you will smile when I use this name, a man named Robert McNamara. See, I knew you'd smile. Yes. Robert McNamara's idea of why he committed this empire with what you'd have to say is a creative president, very creative, was that there was substance to the domino theory that Eisenhower had first voiced in the Cold War. The reason I mention these things is NATO was an invention to make those who participated in it feel safe. It was basically, it was based upon complete fantasy, complete arbitrary fantasy. If Vietnam fell, so would Cambodia and Thailand and Laos. And if they fell, so would Japan. They actually said this. So would the Philippines. And if they fell, so would Turkey. Honest, that's something that McNamara advanced to Johnson. Germanicus, the Americans are doing very well right now, but they've had some bad moments in the last several hundred years, and that has to be one of them.
Well, the domino theory was part of the former American empire, which did seek to create a global imperium eventually when the Soviet Union and the other commie threats were vanquished. And we failed to do that. And so we're retrenching. And a lot of this is about retrenchment, creative retrenchment.
I didn't want to any longer allow the centurions to think that we think NATO was real. It was based upon arbitrary arguments such as I just gave you. I'm not making this up. McNamara said Japan would fall if Vietnam fell. He believed it.
The domino theory is still around, but it has been narrowed down or necked down to a much smaller group of adherents called neoconservatives. But back in the day, Eisenhower and Kennedy and Johnson, etc., it was the reigning ideology of the United States.
Well, it's as if they came up with a defense from Juno the trickster. Good heavens. All right. One other detail comes to me as I apologize for reading 20th century history, but every once in a while it comes your way. That they never used the word Russia, nor China, nor Vietnam. They said communists.
Mm-hmm.
I hadn't realized before reading it again, because these are quotes from their meetings. Much of that is now available that wasn't in the 20th century, things are coming clear. I think because the generation that fought the Vietnam War is dying. Not the men who led it, but the men who fought it, the grunts. That communism was communist this, communist that. They covered up the fact that they were dealing with, in Vietnam, an agrarian peasant population. There was nothing to bomb. Or every once in a while, they would realize bombing an oil depot in Hanoi isn't going to do anything to intimidate the Viet Cong in the jungles of I Corps. Nothing. No connection whatsoever. Every once in a while, they'd say that, but they wouldn't take it into account. And they used the word communist as opposed to Vietnamese or North Vietnamese.
There was a reason for that, and that is that there had to be some specter, so vast and so dark and so evil that, of course, we had to mobilize our society. Of course, we had to run Europe and Japan. And what we're doing today is very different, as we'll discuss, and that is the threat is no longer this gigantic looming colossus. The threat is terrorism, gangsters, anarchic groups out there who wish to hurt America. And that is a sign that the great power verities have shifted. And the
gangsters, the Silesian pirates. Just a moment, I wanted you to come for the Centurions now. We'll enjoy this.
About the Silesian pirates.
Yes, the Silesian pirates were a trouble to trade. And we have versions of them. Think of the drug running in the Caribbean and the cruise missiles fired into the Red Sea tankers by the so-called Houthis. We have versions of pirates today, and there doesn't seem to be an effective method of dealing with them other than violence.
Right. Well, I mean, the Romans never made that their primary threat, just as they didn't make slave revolts a primary threat, because they had bigger fish to fry for a long time. And throughout the empire, there was Persia, there was the great other superpower. Yes. But today that superpower is only China. And so when it comes to these, frankly, not as threatening places, which includes Russia, we have to create a different kind of threat vector, and that's where the whole terrorist gangster thing comes in. Because Putin is not described as we would have described Stalin in 1951 in the Korean War. It's all Putin the gangster, and that's why the shadow fleet is seen as some sort of a criminal enterprise, like Spectre in the James Bond movies. Putin is like the greatest of international criminals, followed by all of these others, including the so-called president of Venezuela right now. And it's the way we started this in Vietnam, but Vietnam could not be seen as gangster. It had to be seen as a kind of a nefarious arm of this greater blackness, like World War II, Hitler. But today, it's much more useful for the U.S., and this has been true since the Bosnian, Kosovo, all of that, and then 2001, 9/11, the idea that the U.S. empire is threatened by evil criminals, and therefore we can show our power by putting them down. And it's the same. It requires the same kind of huge defense effort, but it's directed at a different kind of enemy for very important political narrative reasons.
We're dealing with foreign threats. Let us go to domestic threats. Germanicus, Gaius, we're in Londinium by the Thames. It's fall now. The leaves have changed and dropping off. We're getting ready for winter here in Londinium. Things are well. Things are very well. We hear rumors from Rome of unhappiness, but the Senate's always happy. We're going to discuss that in just a moment, because we're turning to an event that happened in these last days that is strikingly reminiscent of the lives that we've lived. The emperor ordered the legions and their leadership to attend remarks that he and his viceroy made about the mission of the empire. The gathering, which was a sea of ribbons and badges and uniforms, Quantico, Virginia, everything that a Roman emperor could want, all of them sitting in front of you. And he terrified them when we come back. This is I'm Gaius. Germanicus is here. We're in Londinium. This is live. We're broadcasting as best we can to the 21st century to reflect upon events that we find, well, the word irony is what we have. It's not adequate. It's sometimes spooky to see the emperor and his viceroy order the legion leadership to gather together. Nothing in between them, just row after row of commanding officer. Some in brown of the army, some in blue of the navy. All of them grim-faced, no applause, no laughter, grim-faced. And first the viceroy spoke, Secretary of War. And then the emperor spoke, the princeps. And the message was very straightforward. New mission. Fortress America. If you are uncomfortable with that, leave. If you are comfortable with it, we have work to do. Germanicus, I'm simplistic, yes, because we're talking to centurions who want to be reassured that their sacrifice comes to something. I was amazed at the response afterwards because there wasn't a connection made to how it works when you address the legions with a new mission. The emperors in our time were very clear when they passed the word to the legions and marched the 3rd Legion, or the 10th Legion, or the 9th Legion, this way or that way on the Roman roads that the legions are capable of building. I was surprised that there was no connection. I was also surprised, well, I suppose I wasn't, at the inability of the very well-educated editorialists not to see the resonance of what the emperor and his viceroy were doing. They almost ignored it as if
Yes.
knew about it and didn't want to talk to us about it. But I don't want to be suspicious. How did you hear their response to the emperor saying, new mission, fortress?
The response of the elite or establishment was a response of amazing ignorance. They had no idea what was really going on, and they wanted to do nothing more than mock it. And they seemed to have no appreciation for the gravity of the ritual event. I mean, the event was yes, to talk about a new mission, a new direction, but more than that, it was to show who was in command and to have a ceremonial moment where everyone in America and the world could see that the emperor was in command. And this was important, and to a degree, I believe, occasioned by what Mr. Trump endured when he was president in his first term, which culminated in a kind of command disobedience, where the generals not only treated Trump as though he were something of a fool, but also disobeyed him, and may have committed an important breach, as happened when General Milley told the Chinese that he would inform them if the president did something wacky that might occasion some terrible atomic event, and it was all out of proportion. And of course, the lack of support the military gave, the refusal to adequately defend the White House, and we could all see that on television as it was being assaulted. This required, I think, the president to create a ceremonial event that would overturn all of that and say, look, this is the direction we're taking, but this is also the relationship that we have, me, the imperator, and you, the loyal and subordinate legati.
This reminds me that we need to address it's useful for us to address something that we assume when we talk like this,
Mm-hmm.
centurions, that the republic is ending, and that the Republican rules that favor the Senate, aka the Congress, and its assistants, those rules no longer work for the plebes. And that happened in Rome in the 1st century BCE. What I said before, the Gracchi were the plebes, Sulla was the plebes, Catiline would have been the plebes if he'd lived, Caesar was the plebes, always represented by a billionaire, a member of the elite, but speaking with the voice of the common folk. That's going on in America today. We see it, and I think everybody sees it, but some people are adept at denying it and wandering around saying this is not normal. The end of the republic comes to not a reform nor anarchy. The end of a republic in our years came to the princeps.
Mm-hmm.
I think that is the direction we're headed in. I can't tell. Trump is not the end product of a princeps. There's much more that can be done. But he is in that direction.
There's much more to come, of course. And what happened in Rome was a very conservative revolution. And that conservative revolution created the principate and the emperor system. And it happened for a very important reason, and it is likely to happen to the US for an equally important reason, and that is Rome and America were both constitutional systems. Rome had a constitution, and that constitution wasn't written down, but it was a tissue of rituals, of arrangements, customary things, and institutions. And that all worked for 300 years. And then the Punic Wars came along, and Rome got into a series of wars that led it to essentially conquer most of the known world. And those wars incredibly enriched the Senate and created the Roman equivalent of a billionaire class. And the Constitution could not accommodate this. And the people were getting more and more oppressed and more angry. And so you had the train of events that led to the end of the Republic. And it took a long time, just as it's going to take a long time and has been underway in the US for several decades. But you have the emergence in Rome of an oligarchic Senate, of a Senate of big men who are extremely rich. And some of them went with the people, and they became champions of the people because the Roman tribunate had been brought down essentially during the period of the Gracchi brothers when they were so viciously murdered. And the need for the people to have a voice is front and center right now in the US. That's why we have Mr. Trump. And the oligarchic class is mostly focused in blue. And you have blue governors, just as there were senators who were appointed governors of important provinces. So there are governors who are acting in near rebellion to Mr. Trump, and more importantly, there are billionaires who are essentially those who dominate politics among blue, is not just red. And this is all coming to a head because the Constitution of the United States is not something that can be adjusted, and it is not coterminous with the reality that we have. So there are lots of intellectual voices emerging among blue that are saying we need a new constitution, that we need to reimagine the U.S. as a democracy, and we need to remake the framework. Well, that's a transformation that is on the lips of every progressive in America, and they want essentially a progressive revolution, and they're going to try and find a way either to alter the Constitution or to ignore it, which is the path that has been raised by blue, the packing of the Supreme Court, for example, or all sorts of other approaches which would make elements of the Constitution, certain amendments, empty and dead letters. And this is going on in states like Oregon, it's going on in Illinois and California, and it is not what it is announced to be, which is part of a progressive revolution. It is really an attempt to consolidate power among the oligarchy and to create an oligarchic polity, and essentially a single party rule in America, and one that is focused on these elites, the oligarchs, and all of those who benefit from them. And there is a huge popular movement against that. And certain powerful senators, well, among them, of course, Mr. Trump himself, before he was elected and reelected, who have chosen the course, the alternate course, which is to be a champion of the people and to essentially create a counterweight to the Senate. But this is not a situation that can continue forever. And as we saw in Rome, the conflict between a pathway that leads to a consolidated oligarchy, a single party kind of oligarchy in the case of the US, on one hand, and an imperial approach on the other, cannot be sustained. And this is why I think things are going to, at some point, come to a head in the US.
Let me read a quote. You mentioned the governor of California. The predicate here is sending 300 of the National Guard troops of California. The predicate, despite the ruling, the president is sending 300 of his state's National Guard troops to Oregon, California going to Oregon, prompting the state to plan to sue to block the action. And the quote from Mr. Newsom: "This is breathtaking abuse of law and power. The Trump administration is unapologetically attacking the rule of law itself and putting into action their dangerous words, ignoring court orders and treating judges, even those appointed by the president himself, as political opponents." End quote. I choose to believe that the governor of California knows full well what Mr. Trump is doing and has decided to call attention to himself by saying something that doesn't add up. It is not logical. The president has the power to protect his citizens. That's what he's taking. He's taking that power upon himself. If he believes they're ineffectively protected right now by the states. And Mr. Newsom, who has full intention of being president of the United States in the near future, full intention, is challenging something that he would use effectively, just as Mr. Trump is. If he were chief executive, he would do the same thing.
Well, unfortunately,
states. It would be different states, but it would be the same imposition of my authority. And I do not, well, I'll ask you, Germanicus, do you believe Mr. Newsom understands the power of the presidency and is deliberately calling attention to himself, or doesn't understand?
Personally, the feeling that I get is very much, I think, the feeling that I would have had were we back in 44 BC, because at that time the senators, like their equivalents today in the U.S., think that they can simply assassinate the leader and then take over power themselves, and it's a simple proposition. And of course,
in the name of the republic.
Yes, and part of the problem here is, just to be specific, because it occurs to me that the president has the power to put down an insurrection. An insurrection is a difficult word to define precisely, and you can parse it in many different ways. But Blue, it seems to me, has undone itself by making such a big deal of the January 6th incident, calling it an insurrection, calling it the worst thing that's happened to America since the Civil War. And yet it was no more than a riot, and to a serious riot in political terms, but a disturbance at the most. And so it now is open season, I think, for Mr. Trump to call the unraveling in America's cities and the attacks on ICE agents doing their lawful job, to call that an insurrection. And it certainly has that appearance in places like Illinois and California. So, but what's really going on here is a power struggle, and that power struggle has been engaged by both sides relentlessly, and it hasn't been resolved. And you know, you can even use the assassination attempt or attempts on Mr. Trump in the context of what happened not just to Caesar, but also to the Gracchi brothers, and understand that when the society is at a point where it's at loggerheads, where you have two different extremely powerful enterprises going against each other rather than working together, and each feels that they cannot go on without somehow bringing the other to heel, you're going to have a clash. And you have tens of millions of Americans, all those who voted for Mr. Trump, represent a very powerful bloc of populares. And the other side, the senatorial faction, if you will, is most intensely entrenched among elites, and has the money among elites, and that is unavoidable truth. And so they can't continue as they have. You know, the elites have been enriching themselves, as the senatorial class did in the later days of the Republic, with the globalization phenomenon. And just as the various wars that Rome fought against Carthage and Macedonia, and then others, the globalization, just like that period of the Roman Republican wars, impoverished regular people. So the various wars were driving people into penury across Italy, just as globalization and the attendant deindustrialization that was very deliberately pursued in the period after the fall of the Soviet Union until very recently was driving Americans into the same kind of cul-de-sac. And now with the inequalities of wealth and income, both in the Roman Republic and in the US today, are strikingly similar. And the emergence of political movements that are so clearly reminiscent of the same political clash at the end of the Roman Republic, it's hard to avoid the dynamics. The details are so very different. The worlds are so very different. And yet the dynamics of an entrenched oligarchic political faction and a popular movement led by people who believe the leader, the powerful man, is their champion, is unavoidable.
Yes, that's where we're going. And we're going to have a note about the event itself in the Ides of March, because I have one new information from a classicist about that day. And when we come back, Germanicus and I will debate what happened when Caesar was murdered. It was the pathway to what we've been talking about today, the princeps, but the pathway had some details, and we'll return. When we return, we'll discuss them. Marcus Tullius Cicero. This is the Friends of History Debating Society. I'm John Batchelor. This is the Friends of History Debating Society. We're very pleased to welcome you to Londinium. We're speaking of the 21st century, but now we're going to speak of the 1st century BCE, our education. Germanicus is here. The centurions, I've reassured them that all is well in the 21st century, and their sacrifice is worthy of them, and the 21st century thanks them. They were a little unhappy with us making remarks about people defying the emperor. That upsets centurions, retired centurions especially, who've put in 25 years of service to an emperor. And the names change, but it's the empire. We're now speaking to the event that probably begins where we are today, which was the murder of Caesar. So this is the theater of Pompey, built after the original Senate building was built down in disgust at the murder of a particularly important tribune, Clodius, who was speaking for the people, and he was murdered on the Appian Way. And the people of Rome were so upset, and his wife Fulvia whipped up the upset, that they burned the Senate building. They piled all the benches up and set it on fire. So the Caesar didn't go to the Senate building that day. He went to the Theater of Pompey, which is down on the Field of Mars, if you know Rome. And that day he was introducing some important legislation because he was leaving for a campaign against the Parthians. You all know the plot because Shakespeare wrote it up at great length. Brutus and his gang striking down Caesar, whom they saw as a dictator or a king. King was taboo to the Romans. Anybody who talks like a king was unacceptable. That's why they had 2 consuls, not 1. However, this is the Republic now. They saw Caesar as a blow to the Republic. And that was their predicate. That was their motive for murdering him, they said, especially Brutus. Now, here's the new fact. And I shared this with Germanicus earlier so that we could reflect upon it after discussing the princeps. Josiah Osgood, a classics professor, head of the department at Georgetown University, adept in Greek and Latin as only a very, very educated Catholic university can be, very adept, tells me that in Cicero's papers, well, they're not papers, they're documents, tells me there is a story, and the reason they were preserved is after Cicero was murdered by order of Mark Antony, which is ironic itself because one of Cicero's teachers was Mark Antony's grandfather, who's also named Mark Antony. In any event, in the papers, there is a story that when Brutus was helping to slay Caesar, they were all gathered around him and they grabbed his robes. They kept stabbing him, 11 or 12 stab marks. Brutus raised up his dagger and shouted out, "Cicero." And why did he do that? Because I'm told Cicero was in the chamber. I had never, in all the reading I've done for 50 years, come across that fact. Now, it's in Cicero's documents, which is a major piece of what we have of this period. Because Cicero, the good mouthpiece, Cicero was a new man. He wasn't the elite. He aspired to the elite. He had a house on the Palatine Hill, and that was burned down by Clodius, and then they rebuilt it. But he wasn't the elite. He was born a commoner, equus class. "Cicero," he yelled while murdering Caesar. Germanicus, you've had a chance to reflect upon this. What do we make of it? That Cicero, the master storyteller, was caught. He never has been linked to the plot before, and still no one is ready to say that he knew about the plot. But why did Brutus yell out Cicero?
I think that Cicero was the most powerful mind and the inspirational font, if you will, of the senatorial class, and that his thinking and the imprimatur of his logic and his appeals was the sort of the legend, if you will, that conveyed legitimacy to the increasingly oligarchic Senate.
Yes,
and, yes. So he was in many ways. I mean, if Caesar was seen by the plebs as the champion of the people, then senators saw Cicero as a champion of their vision of republicanism and the republic itself, which is very similar to all of the Democrat oligarchs, whether they're governors or senators or billionaires. They always talk about our democracy, and what they mean literally is the possessive our democracy, which means their vision of the American constitutional order moving forward is their vision. What they decide is going to make America a democracy as their democracy. And that's very clearly what Cicero was doing. And yet today, Americans are looking back at Roman history, and I've just been noticing some historical YouTube channels that look at Rome, and their fallback is very much to talk about Cicero as the noble leader of the Roman Republic who would save it, and that Caesar was the evil instigator of empire and would lead to this autocratic system. And in fact, that is the narrative that I think was in the minds of the Roman senators who conspired to assassinate Julius Caesar. And if there had been a comparable conspiracy in 2024, let us hypothesize, then they would have thought that the assassination of Mr. Trump was uh, equally noble and equally necessary if democracy was to be saved, their democracy.
And that is what they attempted in 2017.
Well, there was that conspiracy that we know about now. Nothing has been done yet, and yet that conspiracy has been uncovered on the part of the American president. Then,
do you believe it's still in train? It will keep.
I think it will be, because just as Cicero was critical to overthrowing the Catalan conspiracy, what central to the whole unfolding narrative of the crisis of the Roman Republic is the attempt to delegitimate the other side by exposing a conspiracy, and I think that is, in fact, what is going to potentially spark the confrontation that leads to the pathway either to an oligarchic system in full, which would be called by its oligarchs, its senators, our democracy, or a principate in the same manner as what happened to Rome. And it's interesting to listen to the progressive side in America today talking about transformation and revolution. And yet what Rome had was not transformation back into a republic, and a republic completely controlled by the oligarchs and senators. What you had was a conservative revolution. And that, I think, is the pathway that we're seeing in America today. It will either be a takeover, a progressive revolution, or it'll be a conservative revolution, which, of course, did lead to a principate.
Yes, I'll take it. I'll be reminded of this when we come back to it, because there's no single figure that satisfies all of Cicero's skills. He was the Swiss Army knife of lawyers: prosecution, defense, reconsideration. He'd take on anybody for a price, and he did work for the billionaires. That's important.
Yeah, he did, and there are figures in America. There's a whole cluster of progressive intellectuals who aspire to that role that Cicero had blazed, but we don't have them in view yet, and I think in part because of the poverty of thought on the progressive side. So, there is no Ciceronian figure today on the senatorial side.
This is the Friends of History Debating Society. Germanicus and I are going on to the theater after we sacrifice to Augustus. We're told the theater tonight is going to put on a wonderful presentation of dancers. What's so special about dancers? They're going to perform in the way that they performed for Sulla after he retired. It's wonderful magic. Sulla was a dictator who stepped away after his proscription list, in which he named all the senators who were his enemies and had all their lands confiscated. He retired to the seaside and spent his later years enjoying the arts, going to the theater, and dancing. He loved to dance. The human side of a man, a homicide. In any event, we're going to enjoy them. They're artifacts of the 1st century BCE. Germanicus is Michael Vlahos. I am John Batchelor Gaius. We're in Londinium, where we're very safe. We're safe on the streets. The centurions walk us all the way to Augustus's temple. We sacrifice to Augustus, and then we join the crowd going into the theater. Thank you for listening live from Londinium. Good night.